Welcome to History 111, Lecture 30, Religious Movements. During 1810 to about 1850, the United States saw a broad array of reform movements, and most things were a reaction against something. In large part, this is an ambiguous response to perceived wrongs in American society, and one of the biggest of those movements was the Second Great Awakening. While Protestantism had always been the dominant religion of the United States as a whole, there were a lot of threats to this domination at this time. A lot of elites had abandoned Orthodox Christianity. A lot of the founding fathers, for example, were deists. They believed in a creator God who created the universe and then took no further role in it. These are people who reject the divinity of Jesus and reject the idea of miracles. They believe that ultimately man's reason is going to figure everything out. Another group are Unitarians who split the Congregational establishment in New England, and they took control of Harvard and a lot of wealthy urban churches. And we're going to talk about what the Unitarians' actual particular beliefs are, but these are people who are going to go away in a different direction and come up with what established Protestants in the country think are controversial views. In addition, there's a lot of Catholic and Lutheran immigrants who are going to practice a different form of Christianity that's going to be not in agreement necessarily with the established Protestant traditions of the United States at this point. Now, Transcendentalism is also a particular movement that's going to emphasize emotion and individualism over reason, and that's going to really take hold in certain places, and it gives a voice through people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and that's going to be a subject of a separate lecture, but you do want to know that that is something that the established Protestant faiths within the country are going to have to deal with. The Protestant establishment within the United States is going to be unable to meet changing conditions. There's an insistence on using educated clergy, and that's really not meeting the needs of frontier communities. First and foremost, it was hard to get clergy to go there, because a lot of clergy tend to have middle-class values and like their middle-class lives, and found that the uncouth or uncivilized or simply rough and tumble or otherwise difficult frontier life really wasn't for them, and they really looked down on it and were a bit snobbish sometimes about it. In addition, the Calvinist theology that's dominating American Protestantism at this time is very complex and very restrictive, and it's very hard for people out on the frontier or who are sometimes uneducated or poor to really wrap their heads around. It's very sophisticated, very intellectual theology that's being preached, and that's not really working for people. Now, the disestablishment and the First Amendment, which creates freedom of religion and removes all state churches, is going to go ahead and create competition among denominations. And what that's going to mean is there's a lot of different religious options now for people. However, what we have to realize is there's no way to meet demand for spiritual life using only seminary-trained ministers, because in 1775 there's only one minister for every 1,500 people. Now, by 1845 they're able to bring that down to one for every 500. But that's only because in people's minds, you no longer need to go to school and learn theology. You just need to read the Bible and become passionate and, in some faiths, as they would put it, hear the word of the Lord and then be able to preach. So revivalists who tend to be people who are untrained but have this passion for religion and have studied the Bible on their own and really feel they're hearing the voice of God or being religiously inspired or whatever, however they would put it within the terms of their particular faith, those revivalists are also going to use democratic rhetoric to attack what they see as aristocratic religious elites. So there's really a class dimension with these poor, untrained ministers who are coming up and causing a mass movement going against what they see as these rich, elite, snobbish, established ministers. One of the early groups to break with the traditional Orthodox views of Christianity within America at that time are the Unitarians. Now, they're going to rise up in kind of the late 1700s and really get their theology formalized in the early 1800s. They're a liberal church that's going to break from strict New England Congregationalism. They're going to reject the sort of Puritan ideas that people are horrible sinners who need to be kept in line. They're going to reject the idea of an angry God. They believe that humans can be perfected through effort and that God is ultimately benevolent and loving. They also believe in what they call the unity of God rather than the Trinity. They don't believe in the idea of a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as being separate. They believe it's a single individual God, a single entity. One important person who's a Unitarian minister who we're going to talk about later on is a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's going to become involved in another movement we'll talk about in a bit. Now, one particular group of note are the Methodists, and they come over to America after successfully going through Great Britain in the late 1700s, and that begins with John and Charles Wesley, who are going to begin a reform movement within the Anglican Church, and they're going to later become their own entity known as the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, Francis Asbury was the first Methodist bishop of the United States, and Peter Cartwright's another important name, and he's a circuit rider. And a circuit rider, what they do is they travel a loop of towns and cities, or villages, or what have you, and that's called their circuit. And they just go from place to place, perform religious services, and move on. And that's a solution that's very common at this time because they don't necessarily have the ability to sustain one particular minister in a single community. And often, that if they did that, that would mean that other communities would not have it. So the preacher moves from place to place, serving each community's needs, and basically completes a loop every so often. And what he does, he becomes very popular and really spreads Methodism, and he preaches some important things that really resonate with people, like this idea of salvation as a free gift for everyone, which very much goes against the Calvinist strain that was in the United States at this point. He's also going to set up Sunday schools and Bible studies to help people learn more about religion and more about this Methodist faith. Now, if we look at Methodism on a map, if we see it in 1775 versus 1850, we see a big difference in that 75-year period. Now, the color white represents no Methodist churches, where the color purple represents a very high density of them. And what we can see in 1775 is there's not a lot, but by 1850, Methodism has really spread and taken hold throughout the eastern portion of the United States. Now, another important group are also Baptists, and likewise, they're going to reject Calvinism. Now, John Leland is going to kind of come around, and he's going to take some Jeffersonian ideas about democracy and Christian morality, and really sort of blend them together into this new faith. Now, both Baptists and Methodists are really going to use popular mass culture, and they're going to take advantage of cheap printing to produce Bibles, tracts, Sunday school curriculum, and so on. And they're going to take popular songs and write new lyrics, and really go ahead and spread what they see as this better approach to faith. And they're going to create some interdenominational organizations between the two of them, like the American Bible Society, the American Sunday School Unit, and the American Tract Society. And their whole idea is they want to spread cheap produced materials out throughout the country to help people become better educated about their religion. Now, sometimes these new faiths would also challenge existing race and gender conventions, and initially they're going to preach equality, and women and blacks are even allowed to preach in many churches, but there's a backing off of this over time due to what people say as concerns for respectability, but that really kind of conceals other motives. Now, importantly, a man named Richard Allen is going to found the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church after whites are going to try to segregate St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, and that's going to lead to the establishment of the first independent African American denomination, and that's going to be one that survives through to today and is still quite popular in certain places on the East Coast. Now, with the popularity and spread of Baptists and Methodists, the Congregationalists and Presbyterians are also going to go ahead and start staging their own revivals in the Northeast. And one particular individual that's been important is Lehman Beecher, who's going to travel around preaching conversion. But more importantly is a man named Charles Finney. He's going to develop a whole system for revival that's going to deliberately play on emotions. He's going to very famously convert 100,000 people in Rochester, New York in 1839. And he does this as a big show of religion and really as something that really inspires people and gets them to join his movement. One of the important things that happens within the Northeast is what's called the Burnt-Over District. The construction of the Erie Canal had completely transformed upstate New York. There are the obvious economic consequences of building this major transportation artery, but there are other social consequences as well. Because what had happened was it brought in workers and it brought in all these new people engaged in commerce and so on into these formerly quiet little villages and towns, and it's going to bring with it a lot of problems like drinking, violence, alcohol, and so on. As a result, the social fabric of the region completely unravels, and two major religious movements emerge out of this. The Mormons, who we'll talk about in a bit, and Finney's Presbyterian revivals. Now, Finney went up and down the canal leading large revivals, and this is the man we talked about a second ago with his 100,000 people in Rochester, New York. And he's going to preach that every person could achieve salvation through personal effort. And remember that the traditional American view was that salvation could only come through a miracle from God. So he's preaching something that's completely opposite of what most people had accepted before. Now, Finney's movement is going to really target women, and many of these women are going to find that the traditional role of home life was unfulfilling. Now, these women were going to get involved in this movement and then pressure their husbands and male relatives into also attending. Now, Finney's movement is going to tend to attract middle and upper class citizens who were really benefiting from the canal, but most of them had felt really uneasy about the large numbers of laborers who had been brought in because of the canal, or the various other social problems that came with it. And Finney's movement is going to expand beyond just religion to to include people talking about how are they going to deal with cleaning up the drunkenness and so on that all this has brought into society. The other major movement to come out of this same region is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that begins with a man named Joseph Smith who has some religious visions, finds some gold tablets, and translates them and publishes them as the Book of Mormon in 1830. Now, they're going to go ahead and establish a couple of utopian communities, first in Ohio and then in Illinois. And in both cases, disagreements with other people and some controversies over Mormon practices and some subsequent violence against them are going to lead them to move on. Now, one of the most controversial parts of this church is that it's hierarchical and male dominated, and the polygamy was being practiced. And that was something that was practiced till about 1890, when it was outlawed by the church leaders. Now, ultimately, some of these practices and some of the perceptions of Mormons that were very negative at the time are going to lead to mob violence, and Joseph Smith himself is killed by a mob in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1844. Now, Brigham Young takes over leadership of the movement, and he's going to move them to a place that they call Deseret, which is now Utah. And they're going to move there between 1846 and 1848. And that particular area is going to become part of the United States, but is at that stage part of Mexico. At the same time, there are also some other groups trying to establish utopian societies based on religious ideals, and one of the important groups of note is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, better known as Shakers, and they started in England in 1747. Now, their leader, Mother Ann Lee Stanley, was increasingly believed by her followers to be not only the second coming of Jesus Christ, but also a female incarnation of Jesus Christ. Now, she's going to come to America with 8 disciples in 1774 and establish 19 communities thereafter. Now, her movement had about 4,000 to 5,000 members at its peak, and they're going to live communally and practice celibacy. Today, there's only about 2 or 3 Shakers left. Now, they're going to find, through dance and through experiences like that, real religious ecstasy in their worship, and they're going to embrace modern technology as ways to produce things, particularly furniture, which is a style of furniture named after them, as a way to support these communities. Now, another group of note is the Oneida community, founded by John Humphrey Noyes in 1848. And their whole idea is they want to bring about the second coming through better breeding. And they engage in complex marriage, which is this eugenics program that's designed to bring about the right qualities in an individual and therefore promote the second coming. Now, Noyes himself has to flee to Canada in 1879 to avoid adultery charges, and after he leaves, the religious dimension falls away, and they turn into a joint stock company and abandon all their religious pursuits and these ideas we just mentioned and turn to making silverware. So what's the big idea here? Well, there's a lot of different movements, and they have some things in common, like they all want to make society better, or if not that, they at least want a more spiritual and fulfilling life. Now, these different groups are all moving away from old established religions, and many of them have a democratic character to them or an anti-elitist character. See you in the next lecture.